Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is Dr. David Jacobs. I think David Jacobs is unquestionably the world's leading researcher in the still generally neglected field of alien abduction. There's probably nothing more of a third rail in our culture than this topic. No one talks about it within the space of respectable public discussion, and yet countless people from around the world appear to have had such an experience. That is, they have memories of encounters with non-human intelligent beings who take them, who do things to them, who control them, who can manage their memories to a very great degree. A program that is going on in secret and appears to be something very important. After all these years, UFOs remain a fringe topic within our civilization, but alien abduction is the fringe of the fringe. Yes, even now. And on top of that, there are major differences among some abduction researchers as to whether or not the nature of this contact is a good thing or a bad thing. Well, there is no question where Dr. David Jacobs falls on this matter. For many years, a professor of history at Temple University in Philadelphia, David really became world famous for his work on UFOs and specifically abductions. His take, it's not just bad, it's very bad. We are in the midst of what he has called a planetary acquisition. It's controversial, it's definitely unsettling. But the thing is, in my view anyway, David is remarkably careful and yes, scientific in his approach. Whether he is correct or not is something that only time will tell. Greetings, David Jacobs. Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, and I'm very happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. We've known each other for a long time, but we've never done an interview together. We've had private conversations. I've always enjoyed them. And, just going through the body of your work, you've written 4 full-length books on the UFO subject, 3 on the abduction phenomenon. I'll just offer my own opinion. I think all 4 of them are classics in their own way. They've each got something very unique to offer. Your 3 books on the abduction phenomenon, they were Secret Life, The Threat, and now a few years ago, Walking Among Us. I would just, before I ask you anything, I would like to offer my initial observation. It's not really a question, but it is an observation. Maybe you can comment. I feel that you are the only abduction researcher who has really gone into depth into trying to understand these aliens or these other beings. That is what they are, their biology, their psychology, what their infrastructure happens to be, what their goals are, what are they like, their society. To me, I get the feeling you almost take this like a counterintelligence officer who's trying to get behind the data that's coming to you and really trying to understand them. Is that something that you've been trying to do, or did that just happen?
Well, it happened the more I learned about it. If you read Secret Life first, my sense of the phenomenon was that they were interested in us, they were examining us. That was essentially it. We didn't know why, but that's what it was. And then as more I learned, the more I realized that they were not interested in us and they were not examining us, that something else was going on. And I also began to realize the enormity of the fact that it is global, and which, of course, takes an enormous workforce. And it's been going on for quite a long time, at least from the last quarter of the 19th century. There's no evidence for it before that I know of. Mm-hmm. So it's been going on for quite a while. It's clandestine and it's global and it's secretive, as I point out in my last book, Walking Among Us. So what I've learned is that whereas this was a fascinating and interesting and amazing event, a series of events that was happening years ago that I thought, now I've learned that this is awful. This is terrible. Mm-hmm. This is not something that I ever expected, and that's sort of where I am now.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering. You mentioned the late 19th century, and I've often wondered, Because there are researchers or folks out there who think that that the UFO phenomenon is an ancient phenomenon, and I've heard you say that the UFO phenomenon and the abduction phenomenon are synonymous. You see them as essentially one and the same. But what do we say about the idea that there may have been ancient visitation? Do you have an opinion about this, or do you think that's a non-starter?
All three. I think, first of all, for ancient aliens, we will never, ever, ever, ever know the reality of ancient aliens unless our little friends tell us that eventually.
And if we can believe them.
And if we can believe them.
Yeah.
And the chances of them telling us what they were doing 3,000 years ago is far closer to zero than anything else in the history of humankind. So I wouldn't put my bets on it. So we don't really know what happened 3,000, 5,000, or 2,000 or 1,000 years ago. If these aliens, the ones that we see here around the world, were doing their work 1,000 years ago, then by 900 years ago or 800 years ago, everybody on Earth would be an abductee. Because this is, it's intergenerational. If a person is an abductee and gets married and has kids, all the kids will be abductees. And when they get married and have kids, all those kids will be abductees down through the generations. There will be a point where everybody is an abductee, or certainly most people. And if it happened 1,000 years ago, it probably wouldn't all take that much time. You know, it might be 200 years worth of work or whatever. But we had much smaller populations then, you have to remember. So the chances of it existing before the last quarter of the 19th century are there's just no evidence for it at all. We would know. People would be talking about things that are going bump in the night. People would be talking about little people with giant eyes and things like that in the 15th century.
Exactly. And there is none. You know, it's funny. I've been going through a lot of those ancient sightings just, again, recently. So there's, folks like Jacques Vallée and Chris Aubeck did Wonders in the Sky, which is a compendium of early encounters. And then there's some other compendiums out there. And it's true, you don't get descriptions of little short, bald, gray aliens through any of those years. So it does appear that this is a much more recent phenomenon.
Right. And my guess is that there's plenty of other civilizations out there somewhere. It is always possible that they came here and poked around a little bit and left. But my guess is that would still be ongoing even as we speak. And in fact, when we deal with the abduction phenomenon, those kinds of beings never show up. So who knows? You know, my money is on the fact that that these beings that we see today came here, 140 years ago or whatever it is, and said, okay, this planet is ours. We'll take this planet. This one just suits us fine for whatever we're going to do. And nobody else has come since that time. That's my best guess.
Interesting. Well, may I ask you, to the best of your understanding at this point, after the research you've done, what can we say about these beings? You've said in Walking Among Us, for example, that as far as you can tell, the mantids, or the insectolins, as you call them, they're at the top of the chain, and they're really running the show. They're the beings that look like praying mantises. And I think in your estimation, all the other beings, with the possible exception of the reptoid-looking or reptilian beings, that all of these are hybrid or creations of them. Can you describe this a little bit more, please?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, we just don't have enough information about the insect-like ones. And when people say they're abducted, they almost always talk about gray aliens and others, which I won't get into right now. But they virtually never say that the insect-like ones are in their bedroom. Now, maybe I just don't know enough, and maybe they do say that. But assuming that that's the case, when they first came here and said, okay, we'll take this planet, they had to bring a workforce with them. The question is, why are there reptilian-looking ones on board? That's the mystery. Because the reptilian ones seem to do work that's similar to the gray aliens. They don't seem to have any specific marching orders, so to speak. So we don't really know why they're there. But my best guess is when they first began the phenomenon of abducting people, they had to have a workforce. And the workforce, I think, was reptilians who they got from another planet. Maybe they subjugated in some way. And those reptilian type ones came down and began the process of bringing people back up to the UFO. Using, and eventually, because we were being abducted, they used a little bit of us in making gray aliens. And the reason I say that, in other words, the reason I'm saying that gray aliens might have human DNA in them is because gray aliens have two huge black eyes. Okay, that's fine. They're aliens. They have two holes on the sides of their head for ears. Got to have that. That's important. You can't exist normally without being able to hear around your head. They have, as I said, they have two eyes rather than 3 or 9 eyes, which is what everybody has, and which is necessary. You can't do it with 1 eye, and 3 eyes are not necessary. They have 2 holes for a nose, which is fine. Okay, if they need to have a nose, if something spills or whatever, and that's important. And they have a slit for a mouth. Now the question is, why do they have a slit for a mouth? They do not breathe. There's no evidence for them breathing, and they get very, very close to people, sometimes even touching foreheads. And I've asked people, do you feel their breath on your face? The answer always is no. They don't have lungs. They have very thin little bodies, very skinny bodies. There's no back and forth, the lungs going, expanding and contracting. That does not exist. They don't talk. Everything is telepathic. They don't eat in the normal way that we eat. So why is that slit for a mouth there?
Why have it at all?
Right. It's well. The point is that there's probably human DNA in those gray aliens, which allowed them, once the reptilians began to get people and bring them on board, which allowed for the growth of gray aliens. I think that's a guess. I don't know, but that's my best guess. And it all boils down to the slit for a mouth, which they should not have.
Well, that's interesting. One might argue that it's vestigial from an earlier point in their evolution, I suppose. But I would tend to agree with you. I felt personally for a long time that the body plan of a gray alien doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of natural evolution. It just doesn't seem like a practical body plan to me, the way that they're designed. And I've speculated personally that they were the creation of some kind of artificially created in one way or another. Right.
Yeah. They're very thin. They are not particularly strong, apparently. And they're built for whatever they do. You know, the shorter gray aliens are, I don't know how you would call them, but they pick up after the taller gray aliens. If somebody urinates on the floor, if somebody vomits on the floor, the smaller ones clean it up. The taller ones don't. So there is they have different functions.
I would like to get back to this, actually, but I wonder if it might be more appropriate just for you to describe how you obtain the information that you do from the people that you get it from. In other words, these are abductees. You put them through a process of regression, however you would like to describe that, and then you obtain this information. And, we spoke privately a little while ago, and you were just talking, as you often have done, about how difficult it is to get the actual memory or experience, because there's layers and layers of stuff you've got to get through. It's not easy. Can you talk about how you are getting your information from these individuals that you've regressed over many times over a period of many years?
Yes. Well, of course, when I first began to do hypnosis with abductees, I went to Bud Hopkins' house for 4 years and watched him do hypnosis, and I finally felt that I was ready to do it. And he sent somebody to me who had written a letter to him, who lived in Philadelphia, and so and I had watched Hopkins carefully, and I understood sort of what was going on. And as I said in one of my books, when I first did my first session with somebody of hypnosis, which is just a light form of hypnosis, I made every mistake a human being can make.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. I thought I was doing right, but I wasn't. One of the things I did was I tended to accept at face value whatever this young woman was telling me. And I learned later on that she was telling me things that were not necessarily correct, that they weren't true. Because I asked her, I managed to screw up the very first session we ever did together. And I was too embarrassed to say anything to her about it, because she expected me to be a pro of some sort, and I was not a pro, to say the least.
Wow.
And she told me X, Y, and Z, and I did not have it on my little tape recorder that I put next to her. It was she spoke with a whisper, and the tape recorder didn't pick it up at all. And I went into a panic because I thought I had lost this amazing event. And a couple of months later, I did a lot of sessions with her, and then I asked her if we could redo the first session again, because I had a little trouble with the tape recorder, I said, because I was stupid and foolish, is what the real reason was. But she said, sure. So we did the same session that we did the first time, and she told me totally different things. And I said, well, what about when you said X, Y, and Z before? Remember you told me that? She said, no. I didn't actually say that. That was said by my friend Lydia. That's all. It was her who told me, not me. And I knew at that point that I did not know what I was doing, and that I had to put in different things in my voice and in my questioning to make sure that this never happens again.
So, what is the actual difficulty then when you're putting someone through regression? Is it the problem that their first answer isn't always the most accurate one, or
yes.
What is it?
Number one, the first session is always less accurate than other sessions.
Okay.
A lot of people only have one session with somebody, and that's a problem. That is problematic. It takes about 3 sessions for abductees to learn how to remember. And the first time you do it, they're getting bits and pieces of information. It's not chronological oftentimes. They might lapse automatically without their even knowing it into another abduction event that they had and tie the two together in some weird way. It's very, very problematic. Now, that doesn't mean it's problematic 100% of the time, because some people are very, very careful in how they remember things. But for most people, it's difficult. So I teach them over the course of a couple of sessions how to remember, not by telling them to remember X, Y, and Z, but just by talking to them in a very balanced, chronological way. If you are on a UFO and you're on a bed, well, I'll say, let me back you up a little bit. Before you get on the bed, on the platform or whatever it is, we'll call it a bed, can you see yourself approaching it? They have to approach it in some way. Yes, they can. I say, well, are you standing or lying down? I know I'm standing. I'm walking towards it. Well, let me back you up a little bit. when you're walking towards it, can you kind of see where you were, as you were walking towards it, where you were just before? Well, I was in a hallway. Okay. Well, if you were in a hallway, do you turn right into the hallway, or do you into the room, or do you turn left into the room? Well, we turn right. Okay. Well,
I see.
yeah, and it goes on like that, and that's training a person to be chronological. Because if they're remembering bits and pieces, that's fine, but they can remember a lot more if you put it in very simple terms like that.
So I'm gathering that by trying to piece together a proper chronology of events, and by having the abductee walk through it mentally, this is what allows for memory to correct itself, or to go deeper and to actually not simply accept the first initial sort of superficial memory. Is that basically
right?
what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Well, you can't just assume that in a first session that people are going to remember everything.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't happen that way most of the time. Obviously, I'm not going to, there are some people who do remember everything and all that, but for most people, it takes training and it takes time. And it's not training in on what happened to them. It's just training in how they remember what happened to them.
If I may, then, David, I'm just going to mention the recent study of encounters. I think it's by the organization Free, and it's called Beyond UFOs, and it's about people who have had their abduction experiences, or at least self-reported abduction experiences that this organization has acquired. And of course, they come to a radically opposite conclusion, by and large, to what you have concluded. And their conclusion is that these other beings are generally positive. They're generally here to help us. But what I'm noticing, and I'm going to just assume this is going to be your critique, is that I don't know if any of their data is the result of deep, ongoing hypnotic regression. I don't get the impression that it is, to be honest. It seems that it's almost like an in-depth questionnaire. And am I right in assuming your position would be this is not how you're going to get to the bottom of the matter?
Well, let me put it this way. You're right.
Okay.
No, I don't know why they did that this way. Nobody ever contacted me to help them out in that organization for reasons that I don't understand. But you can't just take a survey of people and say this is the way it really is, when you've got Yvonne Smith and Bud Hopkins and others who did serious research into this phenomenon, and who are coming up with opposite concepts and information about the subject. I don't care whether it's good or bad. I would prefer to have it to be good, of course.
Yes, indeed.
But I go along with what people tell me. Both Bud Hopkins and I have worked with people who are university professors, people who are MDs, people who are attorneys, people who have PhDs in other areas that are not university professors, people who just have normal jobs like everybody else, and people who don't have jobs and can't get it together, and people who dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and everybody in between. And it does not matter what country they come from. They all say the same thing. And that is not because we're trying to get them to say the same thing. It's because I say, well, if you're walking down the hall, do you turn right into the room, or do you turn left into the room?
Yeah, that's very. Thank you for that. Back to these other beings, then. Can we talk about the hybrids? And essentially, one of the things that I've noticed is there is something distinct about. There's a couple of different opinions as to where hybrids, how we get them. So your research indicates that these hybrids are created. They live their early years on board, on ship. Sometimes that's where they live their entire lives. Sometimes they come to Earth and stay here for shorter or longer periods. There are other researchers, and I don't have to get into names, who will say that hybrids are born into human families. They are raised by human families. I'm assuming that you've not seen that in your research.
And nobody has ever contacted me and told me that. I don't even want to hear that. That they had a baby. That baby is theirs. We do know, of course, from the very beginning, from early on, that women are impregnated, and that after about 10 weeks or so, 10 to 12 weeks, the fetus is removed. This is extremely common for women. And oftentimes they think it was just some sort of an odd situation where, what's the word I'm looking for? The fetus just wasn't right and it was expelled. Women have these experiences all the time. And I have to explain to them that from what I know about this subject and what Bud Hopkins knew about this subject, that it was not a normal baby that was expelled. That this is, you're an abductee, it's 10 or 11 weeks. There's certain things that have to happen before there is a baby. And if those things did not happen to the woman and a man somewhere, they don't have a baby. Then it's something else. And it's a difficult situation for women, to say the least. But Bud Hopkins first discovered this many, many, many years ago, before I started doing abduction research with him, or after I had not done abduction research, period. But he called me up one day and he told me that he said, you know this woman is Carol, or whatever her name was? And I said, yeah, I know Carol, yeah. And he said, well, she was on board this UFO, and this is about 1980, 84 or something like that.
Okay.
So she's in this UFO. They brought her over and they showed her a baby. I said, a baby? What do you mean a baby? Huh? What? Mm-hmm. He said, yeah, it was a baby. And it was a weird looking baby. It was weird. It looked like a combination between humans and aliens. It was like a hybrid. That was the first time ever spoken on Earth, that word hybrid, in relation to these aliens. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. This is so crazy. Why would they do that? And then he said, well, they wanted her to feed the baby. And I said, feed the baby? Does she tell them that she can't feed the baby? She's not lactating? There's no, that can't be done. And he said, yeah, she told that she can't feed the baby, but they forced her to put the baby to her breast anyway. I thought at that time, we will never understand alien minds, because it's not, there's something wrong here when everything is sort of fake, and they want to put the baby to her breast, but there's no milk. There's something else going on here that makes no sense. We'll never be able to understand them. Of course, we learned later on that the woman is already, her breasts have already been filled with milk.
Oh, you're saying she was lactating. She was lactating without realizing?
Right. Yeah. What we didn't know until later, of course, was that it already stimulated lactation. And when they put the baby to her breast, she did in fact have milk in her breast. But at the time, it was just impossible for me to imagine why they would do that. Now we know, of course, that it's hybrids. It's all hybrids, and this is a hybridization project.
Right, and this gets me into asking, because these hybrids, in your research, they're all raised on board the craft. They are raised. This is one of the oddest but most fascinating things about your research to me, is the nature of some of these hybrids. They have zero social skills. They are it almost seems incapable of operating a normal kitchen, for example. They don't know how to get food out of a refrigerator, for God's sake. They don't know how to cook on a stove. They don't know how to do the most basic things that we would consider normal. And as I was going through this, reading through your account of this, all I kept thinking was, and they're going to take over Earth. Like, they don't have the first clue of how to manage our society. And I mean, didn't it strike you as like this odd thing? But of course, they have one power, which is that ability neurologically to control us. But I keep thinking, is that enough? They just seem, honestly, not very intelligent.
It's not a matter of intelligence as it is a matter of just knowledge. When they come here, and this is I'm making very large claims, of course. When they come here, as people have told me, they are naive. There's only so much they can learn being on board a UFO. Once they come here and begin to live in human society, their abilities they learn that there's a lot more to learn, an enormous amount to learn. So the abductee takes them to a supermarket and teaches them how to buy food, because you can't do that on board a UFO, obviously. Right. And the abductee teaches them all sorts of things. They're amazingly good at remembering things, astonishingly good, and things don't get mixed up in their minds, from what I can tell, and all information is remembered. So consequently, they're quick reads.
They're quick reads mentally. They actually don't read, though, do they? Or do they? Do they read?
I am not sure.
It was an interesting thing. Like, you know, going through your research, none of the abductees that you regress seem to indicate that these other beings, like, have books or do this type of knowledge. And to me, that just struck me as, like, how would they pass on information? And the impression that I'm getting from your work is that is it what, all telepathic? That they just all mind meld essentially with each other? Is that
No, it is not that.
Okay.
If I live long enough, I will write a book about my experiences, so to speak, via the internet, talking with a hybrid. Now, I know that I fully understand how crazy that sounds, but there is a logic to it that unfolded with me for a long time, until this one hybrid who was living here, had just begun to live here, and I got into a conversation that lasted over something called AOL Instant Messaging, now defunct. I typed out things, and I would type things back. And this was in the room of in the home of an abductee with whom I had worked for many, many years, and who I'm still in contact with, and is not a person who would lie to me.
Right.
So, and I've known her literally since 1999 or 1998.
Okay.
So he was able to write to me, and I was able to write to him, and he read, and I read. So he has learned to do that somewhere along the line.
I see.
Perhaps on board a UFO, I don't know. But at the same time, abductees will teach hybrid children how to do things. I don't know if they've taught them how to read, but as I remember, there were a couple of instances where kids were reading things that they had purloined from human kids' rooms and things like that. So they can read. How they were taught how to read, I don't know, but these are hybrids. They're not humans. They're not fully human. Yeah. They've got other material in their brains that are different than ours, and perhaps better than ours in some way. Certainly better than mine, that's for sure. It's a good question, and the answer is, yeah, they can do all those things. And the ones who are coming down here, they can read, they can write, they can do this, they can do that. Okay. Normal.
Well, their society, alien society, just didn't seem to be one that had books or reading, to say nothing of arts, music, or what we would consider higher culture. Like, none of that seems to exist for them.
They will purloin, they will steal children's books and have hybrid children read the books or look at the pictures or whatever they do. Having novels taken or other thick books, nobody's ever mentioned that to me. Nobody's ever said that to me. So we don't know whether they go on with their reading activities after they learn how to read early on. learn how to read English, that is. I would imagine in France it would be French or whatever, German or whatever.
And the other thing is, well, they not only did they not seem to have like a reading culture, but I would think if I were an alien looking to infiltrate human society, I would at least have TV on board, or even like YouTube today, something where I could observe them through their video culture. But when these hybrids at least first come down to the planet, according to the abductees, they have no knowledge of anything, and I found that actually astonishing.
Yeah, in Walking Among Us, I talked about a group of young children, kids, who came into this one abductee's house. It was looking around, and they looked at the television. They didn't know what it was, and she said, "Well, you watched different things on it," and then they had a cascade of questions about who gets to watch television, how long can you watch television, who makes that, who says things like that, and asking all these questions about how one looks at television and why.
Like, what are the rules of watching television?
What are the rules? That's exactly right. What are the rules? That's what these young kids were talking about. We're not talking about full-fledged humans. That's for sure. And their brains are different than ours. I don't know whether they have the emotions that we have, but I do know that they have the information hidden areas in their brains that we may not have, that they can do and say an awful lot of things that we can't do. I wish I knew more about their brains, but I do know that they can control us, and we cannot control them, and they can do it from not a great distance, but from a distance, from a few feet away, from 6 feet away or something like that, maybe. And that control that's a bad one. That's not good.
I think what makes it the worst is that these hybrids, if nothing else, seem like the contemporary definition of a psychopath. They don't seem to have the kind of emotions or empathy for other people that most human beings have. They seem to be skilled at faking their way through human society, like faking the human emotions necessary to get by. Is that what you've seen yourself?
Yes, I will, and now I'll tell you and your audience a story that was told to me about 6 months ago or so. Mm-hmm. This woman who is an abductee who lives in the state of Iowa, was at her background is that I'd worked with her years ago, and I hadn't talked with her for like 8 years or 10 years, and she called up and told me the story that she worked for a nonprofit organization somewhere in Iowa, or I guess this was in Nebraska, and she worked at a nonprofit organization, a company that does good works for children and people who don't have enough food and things like that. Mm-hmm. And there was going to be a big dinner for all the people who were connected to this organization. And she went, and there was platters of food set out on the table. And there was a couple who looked like they were in their mid-20s or something like that, who had said that they had spent 3 hours, they come up from Arkansas or something like that, to get to this dinner, even though they had no idea. Well, they had no connection to this, but they spent 3 hours to drive there to, which was interesting.
Right.
Now the food is on the platters, and they remove the covers, and the wife sitting across from my friend says, "What's that?" Pointing to rice souffle, a platter of rice souffle.
Yes.
And the guy sitting next to my friend said, "Well, it's rice souffle." And she, the wife, said, "Well, what is that?" "Well, it's a mixture," he said, "of eggs and flour and rice and this and that." And then she said, "But what's that?" Pointing more to it and more to it. And then everybody realized she was pointing at the rice. She'd
Wow.
never seen rice before, and neither had her husband, who just sat there and listened, as opposed to elbowing her and saying, "What the hell's the matter with you? It's rice."
Yeah, exactly.
She called me up to tell me that this story that had happened to her after 8 or 10 years of not talking to me, but she knew something was different here, that could not possibly have happened. Rice is probably the most eaten food in the world. You cannot grow up in America and not know what rice is. That is just not possible.
Yeah, agreed. But, well, actually, one thing that you pointed out, at least toward the end of Walking Among Us, is that this, incredible lack of knowledge that many of these hybrids and hybrids, as you have called them, have had, seem to be overcoming it. So they seem to be getting to a point now in our own time that they're getting up to speed. So maybe there's going to be less and less of that, and that they are more and more fully integrating themselves into human society.
Well, you're talking about two different things. You're talking about integration, right, and growing numbers of these beings coming down, and then you're talking about, at the same time, how they're learning while they're here, when they're finally here.
Okay.
But you have to remember, this is a global phenomenon. It's just astonishing. Every once in a while, people write to me and say, "I live in Germany. There are no abductees in Germany."
Right.
And I got a little pile of people who've written to me from Germany, fill out a form that I have, which is, they're obvious abductees. And this is a global phenomenon. There's a friend of mine, Young-Hae Chi, who's a professor at Oxford University, and I taught him how to do hypnosis with abductees. And he specializes in Korean studies, and he goes to Korea every year for several months. And he now does abduction research with Koreans and also with Japanese. It's all the same. It's happening everywhere.
So they're getting the same data, in other words,
yeah,
from all over.
It's everywhere. It's this one large group of beings out there in the atmosphere somewhere, and this is a serious situation. I look at this and I think to myself, I don't think that my sons are going to be living the lives that they think they're going to be living. They're both older, mm-hmm. but I fear for the future. I never would have imagined myself saying something like that some years back, but now I have no choice. The evidence is overwhelming. It's sort of mind-boggling that this is happening, and that it's headed towards something. They're not doing this because they're experimenting on us or anything like that. This is headed towards what I would imagine to be a major event where they will suddenly take over the Earth for reasons that we do not know.
Well, this brings us to the change, and you've written about this, and I wonder, we've got about 10 minutes remaining here. Can you talk about what is this change? You got this phrase from a number of your folks. What can you say about this?
Well, one of my books, people began to tell me that the aliens were telling them that soon there was going to be a change. The change was coming. Everybody was going to know his place. It was going to be wonderful. The change is coming. The change will be. And I always wondered what the change was. Mm-hmm. And I would ask abductees, well, what is the change? They must have told you what the change is going to be. Nobody knew. And if you think if this were psychological, well, everybody would know, and it might be different for every person, but they would say, well, the change is when this, that, whatever. Mm-hmm. But nobody knew. So, and let me just say also that nobody was aware that other people were saying that, obviously.
Right.
When I began to understand that these aliens were now coming down to Earth and beginning to live here, then I began to realize that the change was that this was, in fact, a takeover situation, and that the change for these aliens was that the Earth would be changed because they would then be in control. That's my best guess. And they would be living here, and they couldn't care less about the ones who are normal humans. They've got their own humans that they've been making, so to speak. But whatever it is, this planet will be theirs, I think. That's my best guess. They've been doing this for a long time. There's a reason for it. It's not just because they like examining humans. No. There's a reason for it. They are working towards this change of people who will be living here, I think. That's my best guess.
I've actually wondered that this would be actually an ideal society for them to conquer or to take over if they wanted. We're just on the verge of developing, implementing worldwide 5G smart device technology where every device is talking to every other device. The ability for a complete 24/7 surveillance into everyone's home is a reality. And just imagine hijacking that kind of infrastructure. It's like ready-made for them. They've got the neurological control, and if you put them in, strategic places within global society, they actually could have the capability to control even beyond their neurological limitations of power. You know what I mean?
It is certainly possible. Anything is possible with these beings. You have to remember that these are extremely advanced people, so to speak. Their UFOs simply disappear, or else they fly so fast away somewhere that nobody can see them fly. It's faster than the speed of light. You'll notice that on board a UFO, they're flying here, they're flying there, whatever. People do not feel any gravitational pull like you are in an airplane. If it suddenly starts to make a left bank, your body sort of moves to the right a little bit. Nobody has ever described anything like that. We have no knowledge of what their life is like outside of what people describe to us. We don't know whether aliens of any type sleep. We don't know how we know how gray aliens eat, but we don't know whether the other two, the insectolins or the reptilians, whether they eat or not. We don't know how they get fuel. We don't know anything. But what we do know is that this is extremely advanced technology. It's not just one layer above us. They have come through space from somewhere, we don't know where, and flown here and have decided to take over. God, I hate to say this because it sounds so crazy, but to take over the planet, if you will. And they've done this before, almost certainly, and they're doing it in a routine fashion. They are extremely advanced. It's not like they're a few years ahead of us, or 10 years ahead of us, or even 100 years ahead of us. They might be 1,000 years ahead of us for all we know. And they're smart. And they retain things in their brains, just like we do, and they learn things just like we do, and all that. Now, I'm not talking about gray aliens necessarily, because they're different. They're workers who are created to do work.
You're talking about the insectolins, the ones at the top of the chain.
I'm talking about the ones in charge, the insectolins especially, and hybrids, because hybrids have human DNA in them, and they've got these. They have brain power that human beings don't have, and they can all talk telepathically. Now, of course, all abductees talk telepathically too, but mainly on board a UFO. So
what can we do? Is there? I mean, you've mulled this over 1,000 times or more, I'm sure, and I don't know if you have any answers, but have you thought of? Is there any hope? Is there anything that humanity can do in the face of this threat?
I don't know if there's anything that humanity can do in the face of this threat. The problem is that people of goodwill who are intelligent, far more intelligent than I am, need to get together and understand what is happening and then try to figure out some way of dealing with it. It may be too advanced to deal with it. It may be too late to deal with it, but at least we might have some sort of a fighting chance. That is not happening. As you know, there's an ongoing study of UFOs, and Luis Elizondo, I guess is his name, has been going around to different UFO conferences and talking about what's going on there. Mm-hmm. And what the group is doing is primarily trying to see whether UFOs are real, as if this were 1947.
Exactly.
I asked Elizondo, well, have you been doing any research into the abduction phenomenon? He said he's not at liberty to tell me that. So they may be doing something, but it's small potatoes. It's tiny. What they should be doing is contacting me, for example, who spent my most of my life studying UFOs and abductions, and Yvonne Smith and others who do this kind of research.
Agreed.
And debriefing us in terms of what we found and all the rest of that stuff. And they would start doing abduction research also, because that is the only way you can get inside a UFO, period. You can't get inside it. They're studying the outside shells of objects. They're not studying what's going on inside. Inside is the important part. So they would then start doing hypnosis with abductees, and they would realize the import of this, and there would be thousands of them doing abduction research now as we speak. And we would know it, because abductees would eventually tell us. That has not happened. It is not happening. They're still trying to figure out whether UFOs are real. This is nonsensical. It is beyond stupid. It's criminal.
Yeah, really, the only hope would be worldwide wake up right now or yesterday or last week and move in a coordinated effort to understand and then hopefully deal with this challenge. That's never happened with our society, with the world. We're still in this little fairy tale of UFOs. Are they real? Are they not here? Are we alone in the universe? Like these first grade level questions that just keep us spinning around in circles, unfortunately.
That is exactly correct. It makes me angry. It's just it's just craziness. It's absolute craziness. This is a global phenomenon. People around the world are reporting the same things. They're seeing the same things as they have always seen them for decades and decades and decades. And now they're saying the same thing. Now, here's another way of looking at this. Supposing none of this is true. Mm-hmm. Supposing there aren't no aliens up there who are kidnapping people. And yet, all around the world, people are saying the same things about the abduction phenomenon. And it's happening to them. And it's not happening. If that's the case, then we have stumbled on one of the most important aspects of human mentality. So
psychological aberrations.
Right. Around the world, all saying the same things with these same psychological aberrations, and not knowing that other people are saying the same things.
Right. Well, one thing that is...
I'm about to say that is profoundly important. You'd think that scientists would get interested in this fake phenomenon that everybody is talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's much more unlikely than the actual likelihood that there are others who are walking among us and are here. The one hope, the only thing that I could say is the silver lining here is that they must operate clandestine. They must be secret. And so therefore, my assumption is if they were not operating in secrecy, we would have the ability to oppose this program. So there's always that.
That is right. Because they're secret, it means that that they're afraid of something.
Right.
That they're not in total control. That there's something else that they want to. They can't let us know about it because it's a weakness of theirs. There's a weakness there. We don't know what the weakness is. We don't know if we could ever stop it. That's for sure. But we don't have enough super intelligent people to get together by the hundreds, if not the thousands around the world and try to figure out what can we do about this phenomenon. And as long as they're secret and as long as nobody knows, then they're pretty free. But the point is that there has to be some sort of weakness there because they are secrets.
Well, David, I really appreciate your time on this, and I know your time is very valuable, but I'm very grateful that we've had this hour to talk about your important research. I hope that you're actually able to follow up with that last book that you were talking about, which is some of the nature of these beings going a little bit further.
I've been trying to write a book about how to do hypnosis with abductees, which I will release to the public in some way or another. When I finish that thing, which I hope I can do, I've been saying this for 10 years now, which I think I'll do by next week. Then I will write this book about my own interrelationship via Skype, essentially, with hybrids and how this came about, knowing full well that I might have been part of some sort of a horrendous trick from a very good friend of mine who I've known for 20 years and who would never, ever, ever do anything like that. But I'll let people decide one way or the other. It's interesting no matter what.
Indeed, it would be.
Then I should be about 100 years old by that time. So that time, and then I'll just retire then.
David, thank you so very much.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate the time that you spent with me.
My pleasure. That concludes my interview with Dr. David Jacobs. To hear David and I continue this conversation, you can go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where he and I go quite a bit further in some of the aspects of this discussion. Thanks for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.